the Middle Ages officially starts about 493 AD, the Middle Ages. And while the secular humanists, especially starting with Voltaire in the so-called Enlightenment, named after Lucifer, light bearers, we've had this even in South Africa where you get the Verlichte, who promote abortion, pornography and so on. And you get the Verkrampte, who against this kind of return to paganism. So they often like to portray themselves enlightenment, even though actually they're darkness. Woe to those who call light darkness and darkness light. The Middle Ages, what many call the Dark Ages, were not dark at all. They were the Christian Middle Ages as Europe was evangelized and as nation after nation bowed to Christ. And this begins, why we started with 493 AD, is because that's the date when King Clovis of the Franks converted to Christianity along with thousands of his warriors. Line up, march through the river, you're all going to get baptized, we're all going to be Christians now. And you may think, well, that's not exactly the way that you get converted. But the kingdom of the Franks was converted 493 with the conversion of King Clovis. This is actually the missionary pattern of how Europe was Christianized, evangelized. The leader, the king, the chief was normally converted first, and then the people would come on to. Now, did this make them Christians? No, but it made them open to the evangelism and discipleship, out of which real conversions came. So, for example, if I can jump ahead to 1945. 1945, the United States has just dropped the first 2 atom bombs in the world on Nagasaki and on Hiroshima. Sadly, 2 of the most Christian cities in all of Japan. Wiped out 15,000 Christians with atom bombs, actually. Sadly, in that Buddhist country, wiping out a very core part of the Christian leadership. Why they chose those 2 most Christian cities in Japan can only be because anti-Christians had a hand in the decision of this bombing. But nevertheless, after this hideous war, and this highly destructive war, the king, the Emperor of Japan, comes to the American Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Theater, General MacArthur, who is a fine man, and I would normally not want to criticize him, but on this he is to be blamed. Emperor Hirohito asked General MacArthur, I suppose I must become a Christian now. And General MacArthur answered in typical American individualism, oh no, that's a personal decision. He should have known his history better. If the Emperor of Japan had gotten converted to Christ, the majority of his population would have followed. That wouldn't have necessarily saved anyone, but it would have opened up the Japanese people to real evangelism, discipleship. Something good could have come out of this hideous, destructive war. But sadly, the individualism of America had so infected the mind of General MacArthur, who otherwise was a fine military leader, but on this, he plainly was ignorant of missionary history. Europe was converted by kings coming to Christ and commanding the people to follow them through the waters of baptism. And that is the way, the pattern for most of church history. So, the baptism of King Clovis, highly significant, major, and this is where we generally mark the beginning of the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages were always understood as the Christian ages, when Europe became Christendom, or the kingdom of Christ. Well, one of the first missionaries of the Middle Ages to focus here would be Columba, the missionary from Scotland. Columba was described as a robust child, full of mischief, full of energy, and combative. In other words, he liked to fight. He was described as a fine figure. His splendid colour, his noble manliness made him beloved by all. Tall and strong, his first-rate mind, his zeal for learning, combined with a powerful voice and a well-developed sense of humour, made him very popular. Selecting 12 companions from amongst his old and trusted friends, Columba sent out and established a mission station on the island of Iona. That's about half a mile off the Scottish mainland on the west coast. From this missionary base camp, Columba and his co-workers launched missionary outreaches amongst the warlike Picts and Scots of Scotland. It's important for us as Protestants not to be too prejudiced against the monks and the monasteries, because the monasteries in the first half of the Middle Ages were actually fine missionary training bases, training centers, Bible colleges, and they were very much the heart and soul of fulfilling the Great Commission in the first half of the Middle Ages. In the second half of the Middle Ages, after the 11th century, they got more and more corrupt and they lost the evangelistic zeal. And so the the monasteries that, for example, Wycliffe and Huss and Luther were attacking were not the monasteries of Columba and of Patrick. They were the monasteries that had been completely corrupted. It's not fair to judge something from what it is nearly 1,000 years later with how it was originally. Columba himself lived a Spartan lifestyle in austerity. He slept on a bare rock with a stone pillow. I mean, how's that for austere and Spartan? Under his leadership, the Iona community was a place of constant activity where monks engaged in agriculture, work, carpentry, prayer and study, with evangelistic preaching and missionary work in nearby Scotland. A very fine Great Commission course type program. From Iona, Columba and his missionary monks spread out to make an immeasurable impact for the gospel on Scotland and the entire Celtic Christian world, planting mission stations as far afield as Lindisfarne. From AD 563 to 597, Iona was the centre for the evangelization of Scotland and northern England. Using the political context of his royal lineage, Columba developed relationships with the chiefs and the kings to aid in the conversion of their subjects. Columba and his monks founded possibly more than 100 monasteries or mission stations throughout Europe. Phenomenal industry and productivity. Columba and his men undertook missionary outreaches as far afield as France, Germany, Switzerland and Italy. Now, for some people this may be news, because many people, especially if they've gotten a history from Chick publications, assume that nobody was converted between the time of the Apostles and the time of the Reformation, and that it was just one big wasteland. Not so. There was an enormous amount of great evangelistic missionary work and Bible study going on in the Middle Ages. And you can see how far afield he went, all the way around across Europe, as far as Switzerland. Columba left an indelible mark on Irish and Scottish Christianity, bequeathing to his converts a love for books, especially for the Bible. Columba's emphasis on bold evangelism and missionary vision inspired thousands of missionary volunteers from Scotland and Ireland through the centuries. Hence this book that they brought out some time ago on how the Irish saved civilization. Well, they certainly preserved books and libraries, and they certainly sent out evangelists, and they planted a lot of monasteries, and they revived learning and evangelism throughout Europe. So to an extent they can be justified in saying that. Columba had a passion for missions. He preached, practiced and lived missions. He wrote poetry. He instilled a love of poetry and music into his converts. He emphasized the evangelistic impulse in Christianity, and he promoted it in every way he could throughout his productive life. So again, from Patrick Johnson, we've got a snapshot, the world in AD 600, the Celtic kingdoms of Ireland and the British Isles. You can see the Frankish kingdom is the strongest kingdom in Christendom at this stage. It's got a Christian king, and so the kingdoms of the Franks control not only what we today would call France, but also Belgium, Netherlands, and parts of Germany as well would be part of that. Notice the Nubian Christian kingdoms have grown up also here in the 6th century. More about that later. And Aksum of Ethiopia. Ghana's growing up into a decent-sized kingdom as well. You can see the Soy Indians, the Magyars, or what we used to call the Huns. They've now changed the name to the Magyars. You also get the Khazars, many of whom converted to Judaism about this time. The Khazar empires between the Christians and the Muslims, and they thought the best way to avoid war with both was to choose to be Jews. And in fact, statistically, most of the people today belong to what is called the 13th tribe, and that's even accepted by the University of Tel Aviv and so on. The Khazars or Khazarians are most of the people who today call themselves Jews. They're not ethnically of the Hebrew tribe, but they were converts, and they're roughly in the area of what you today would call Ukraine. The Sassanid Persian Empire here, you can see having a huge amount of territory. They persecuted the Christians quite severely. So you can see the Christian world in the 7th century. The blue represents where it's politicized Christianity, like Spain and France and Ireland and Nubia and Aksum. Also the Byzantine Empire, of course, the Eastern Roman Empire. Also Armenia, those are strong Christian areas. The other areas, you can see the brown is where Christianity is in severe decline, and the reason is the rise of Islam and the annihilating of many of the Christians. Also, tremendous wiping out of Christians in large parts of North Africa and Middle East, the red lines here, where Islam came and wiped out vast amounts. And also the Chinese started to persecute many of the Christians in China. Most people are not aware that there were many millions of Christians in China in the 7th century. And so the persecutors were the Persians and the Muslims and the Catholics to a degree. The martyrs were mostly Coptic and Assyrian Christians, also Celts and Eastern Christians. We come to the Venerable Bede, father of British history. Now, just as a quick check, how many of you here know much about the Venerable Bede? Well, you all use this calendar. Bede was one of the most influential Bible teachers and historians, and it's from his practice of dating events from the incarnation of Christ. He's the one who innovated Anno Domini, AD, that are present dating method of separating events to before Christ, BC, and after Christ, AD, in the year of our Lord, Anno Domini, came into general use. So he, in the 7th century, is the one who innovated our present calendar system that we use to this day. Bede was a prodigious writer. He wrote 45 books, including commentaries, textbooks, translations, and histories. His knowledge was encyclopedic. He wrote grammatical and chronological works, geography, hymns, poems, sermons, biblical exegesis, the first martyrology, like Fox's Book of Martyrs type thing in early form, with historic notes. Although most of his works were in Latin, Bede was also the first known writer of English prose. He wrote in Saxon. His didactic and ethical works are so widely spread throughout Europe and so highly esteemed, he was called the teacher of the Middle Ages. He engaged in lengthy research concerning seasons, cycles, times, and events, and in 703 wrote On Times, and 20 years later, 723, he wrote On the Reckoning of Time, and that's how our modern calendar came about. His chronological research and calculations profoundly affect the way we continue to date events to this day, including how we date Easter and why we have it at different days of the year because of how he's working it out through the lunar cycles. Bede led a life of simplicity and devotion, always occupied with learning, teaching, and writing. He was zealous in the performance of his duties. He was known as the most learned man of his time, proficient in patristic literature, that's of the early church fathers, meaning he studied Augustine and Origen and Tertullian and Athanasius and so on. Bede was described as kind and generous with a tremendous love for truth and fairness. Many expressed admiration for his devotion to the Lord and his service to God's people. Bede wrote, "The door of the kingdom of heaven is not opened to those who only know in their learned minds the mysteries of faith and the commands of their Creator, but to those who have progressed far enough to live by them." It's not just head knowledge. One of his greatest achievements was the invaluable ecclesiastical history of the English nation, completed in 731 AD. This authoritative history of Christian origins in Britain speaks of the Celtic people who were converted to Christianity during the first 3 centuries after Christ, and details how the coming of the Anglo-Saxons and the subsequent conversion by the Celtic missionaries. Bede's devotion to truth and accuracy set an unprecedented standard for future historians. His ecclesiastical history remains the major source of information of life in early England. Bede described the importance of history. For if history records good things of good men, the thoughtful here is encouraged to imitate what is good. Or if it records evil of wicked men, the good religious leader or listener is encouraged to avoid all that which is sinful and perverse, and to follow that what he is in God. Bede emphasized the evangelical and civilizing mission of the church, and the history of nations has moral meaning. Deuteronomy 28. Their blessings for obedience, their curses for disobedience. The prayer with which Bede closed his ecclesiastical history gives an insight into the motives of this dedicated disciple of Christ. I pray you, noble Jesus, that, as you graciously granted me joyfully to abide in the words of your knowledge, so you'll also of your bounty grant to me at length, to yourself, the light of all wisdom, and to dwell in your presence forever. If you instruct the brethren these things, you'll be a good minister of Christ Jesus, nourished in the words of faith and of the good doctrine which you have carefully followed. Another great missionary of the early church is Boniface, the apostle to the Germans. Boniface, originally called Winifred, has been described as the founder of the West and as the apostle to the Germans. Boniface was undoubtedly the most successful, or one of the most successful missionaries of the first millennium. He not only converted many individuals, but he helped disciple an entire nation. A contemporary described Winifred as he seemed to glow with a salvation-bringing fire which the Lord came to send upon earth. He surpassed all his predecessors in extent and results of his missionary. With fearless ardor and indomitable perseverance, he sought to evangelize the pagans. Boniface was zealous in evangelism and in suppressing idolatry. He established churches and monasteries, he destroyed idols, he baptized heathen, he opposed corrupt and immoral clerics, he dealt decisively with heresy, he made many enemies. He is described as difficult, prickly, and tactless, which is a tight description you could give to the nation that he helped convert. In a dramatic confrontation of the pagans of Hesse, Boniface hacked down the sacred oak of Donau in Geismar. The huge oak was a shrine to the pagan god Thor, and as the tree fell to the ground, it broke into 4 pieces and revealed itself to be rotten from within. Thor's lack of response in the eyes of the pagans, because they were waiting for Thor to strike him dead with a thunderbolt, which didn't happen, established the authority of the Christian God. Christ must be more powerful than Thor. And this led to thousands of conversions. The historian Williband described the scene. A great throng of pagans who were there cursed him bitterly among themselves because he was the enemy of their gods. However, when they saw the rottenness of the felled oak, they stopped cursing and they, believing, blessed God. Boniface used the wood from this felled oak to build a chapel in Fritzlar, which became a center for his new mission station. How's that for bold and practical? As Boniface continued to clash with the pagans, heretics and fellow Christians, he became convinced that the church needed to be reformed. No church councils had been held in the Frankish realm for decades. That was before his arrival. So now Boniface convened 5 councils between 742 and 747. Boniface took the lead in removing corruption from the existing churches, and he caused a lot of friction with the Frankish clergy. Most of the Frankish clergy resisted Boniface's work of reform and evangelism, and he had to send word to England to recruit more Saxon missionaries to support his dynamic mission. And having thoroughly evangelized Thuringia and Hesse, he turned his attention to Bavaria. Now you understand that England became known as England, Angleland, because of the Germans who came there from the Angle tribe. They were and the Jutes, they came from Jutland, which today is mostly Denmark. And the Saxons came from Saxony, which is where Martin Luther was the missionary in the capital of Saxony, which then was Wittenberg. Dresden later became the capital of Saxony. So the Anglo-Saxons, both the Angles and the Saxons are Germans, and the Jutes were from mostly Denmark. And the Normans and the Danes came from Norway and Denmark. The Norsemen were also Vikings from North, so the Norman invasion was again Vikings. So England originally was made up of Celts, meaning the people of Wales, Scotland, the Picts and the Irish. They're the original inhabitants of the British Isles. The Angles and Saxons were the invaders who came in the 5th and 6th centuries from Angleland. And so England is a term from Angleland. Angleland became England. And it's made up of Angles, Jutes, and Anglo-Saxons. And so today, the only original Britons are actually the Welsh, the Irish, and the Picts and the Scots. The people who took over England are all basically Germans, effectively. And it's interesting that then you had the Saxons who were converted by the Celts in England, took the gospel back to Germany. And then later, from Germany, the Reformation spread and came back to England. So there's been a mutual blessing between the countries, at least before the 20th century. Fulda became the spiritual hub of Christianity in Germany, and Boniface and his followers traveled throughout the land, destroying pagan shrines, building churches, baptizing many thousands. He established a vast network of schools and mission stations. You know, this is why it's just so wrong that the impression you get from the average Hollywood films and even from church history books is that there was this dead religious Roman Catholic structure of ritual and there was no spiritual life in Europe for the whole of the Middle Ages, which is so false. It's so untrue and so unfair. And we deprive ourselves of a whole treasury of the church if we ignore the spiritual life of the tremendous work that was going on in the Middle Ages. As Boniface declared, let us die for the holy laws of our fathers. Let us not be dumb dogs, silent spectators, hirelings who flee from the wolf, but faithful shepherds, watchful for the flock of Christ. Let us preach the whole counsel of God to the high and to the low, to the rich and to the poor, to every rank and age, whether in season or out of season, as far as God gives us strength. Boniface died for the Lord, boldly. Throughout his ministry, Boniface hungered and thirsted for the Pentecostal power of the Holy Spirit. He consciously discipled and disciplined his life to faithfully follow the example and teachings of Christ. He eagerly embraced the suffering that comes from preaching and living the gospel. He proved to be an effective missionary, an exceptional organizer, a superb administrator, and a courageous reformer. Here he is depicted as confronting the pagan witch doctors, or druids as they'd call them. Throughout his extensive dynamic missionary outreaches, his reform of the Frankish churches, his uniting of the churches in southern and central Germany, his revitalizing of nominal Christianity throughout northern Europe, Boniface became one of the most prominent role models for later missionaries and a key figure in the creation of medieval Christian Europe. A deadly date in church history is AD 632, the rise of Islam, and the annihilation of Christian communities throughout North Africa and the Middle East. And by that we mean the heartland of the church. Remember, Islam rose right in the very Middle East where the gospel was born. We need to remember that places like Antioch, where the early church sent out the first missionaries from, that's in what today is Syria. Damascus, on the road to which the Apostle Paul was converted and called, that's in war-torn Syria today. The whole of North Africa was the strongest theological heartland of the church, wiped out by Islam, well, except for Egypt. Christians stayed firm there in Egypt. The churches throughout what today is called Iraq and Iran were solidly, strongly Christian. So the rise of Islam basically destroyed 50% of the church. Literally, the church's numbers decreased by a full 50% in the first century of the rise of Islam. Absolutely catastrophic. Over 3,200 churches were destroyed by Muslim jihad in North Africa just in the first century of Islam alone. And of course, there came to be crusades in reaction to the rise of Islam. 100 years after the death of Muhammad, AD 732, Charles Martel, the Hammer, stopped the Muslim advance at the Battle of Tours in France. Tours, or Poitiers, just south of the Louvre River, they gathered the warriors of Europe and they stood firm against 6 furious charges of the Muslims, the Muslim cavalry, which had been undefeated up till then. They conquered Spain, Portugal, they're moving up across the Pyrenees, they're moving up the heartland of Europe. This is a key date because if Charles Martel had failed to stop the Muslims there, what we later knew as Christendom would have become Eurabia. And it would not be, where would the Reformation have come from? Where would the church have come from that brought us the gospel and so on? So it was an absolutely important battle. Many battles are a waste of time. Many battles were not for good purposes. But this is one battle where literally the future of Christian civilization depended on the result. There were other battles. There were many, many, many times that the Muslims tried to conquer Constantinople, including in the first century of Islam. And the Byzantines were so advanced, they had Greek fire, something like napalm. They had a pump that shot out effectively like a flamethrower from the bow of their ships, petroleum-based products that would ignite and, of course, incinerate these wooden ships and so on. So they incinerated the entire Turkish fleet many a time over. And so the picture that you frequently get in Hollywood of these backward Christians, benighted backward Christians, and these advanced Muslims, well, the Christians were the ones who invented everything from the stirrup for horse and saddles through to proper harnesses, to wagons that could be turned, through to the different means of harnessing horses for better steering. Their forms of ploughing was far superior. The agriculture, every single thing you want to look at, the Christians are more advanced. So, for example, when I've been debating with Muslims in Muslim universities, I've had them sometimes say, we had flush toilets and street lighting in North Africa in the 7th century. I said, I know, but you didn't have it in the 8th or 9th or 10th or 11th or 13th or 12th centuries, did you? No, because they had advanced systems of plumbing and electricity in North Africa before the Muslims conquered them, and for a while afterwards, because they were the Christian majority population in North Africa, but they destroyed it. North Africa used to produce wheat and vineyards. There were vast, massive forests and huge lakes in North Africa, which later were turned to total desert by the deforestation methods of the Arabs. And this aspect of history has often been ignored, the fact that the whole of North Africa was in fact a massive grain breadbasket for the Roman Empire. And they destroyed it. They destroyed everything. They looted the treasuries of the pharaohs. When people speak about all these treasure troves and all the pyramids that were looted, they were looted by the Muslims. In fact, the damage done to the Sphinx of the cat-like creature outside the Great Pyramids, that was Arabs shooting cannons at it to shoot off the nose and everything else. The destruction of just about everything that you see of the great civilizations in Athens and Greece, that was done by Muslims when they took over and destroying that. There's often this trying to hide the fact that some nameless people destroyed, but Islam's a wonderful religion of learning, and, well, not really. In fact, what Muhammad said when he came to power, he said, if you find books that confirm what's in the Quran, we don't need them. If you find books that disagree with what's in the Quran, we don't want them. Burn them. And so it's order for the Muslims when they took libraries like the greatest library in the world, 6 million volumes in the library in Alexandria, the greatest city of learning in the world. They burned the entire library, 6 million manuscripts, including original copies of the Bible, no doubt, and many other things. To speak of it, Islam being a great religion of learning, when they were burning libraries and destroying ancient monuments and looting tombs and ransacking churches and all the rest of it, it's insane. But of course, we've got a news media, an educational institution that's in love with Islam. Well, at least they hate Christianity. Maybe they don't love Islam, but they love the fact that Islam's against Christianity and that they behead Christians and destroy Christianity. So even the feminists who know that, well, feminists get beheaded, shot, or hung in Muslim countries, but nevertheless, they're against Christianity. And you get the gays. They know that, well, gays get shot, hung, or thrown off high buildings in Muslim countries, but nevertheless, because Islam's anti-Christian, they hate Christianity even more than they love their own lives, it seems. And so you see, all the anti-Christian forces in the West are very pro-Islam simply because they hate who Islam hates, which is Christianity. Inspired by Muhammad's doctrine of jihad, the Saudi Arabians launched the first major colonial enterprise in history. When people speak about jihad being only defensive, you could say, well, what were Saudi Arabians defending in Spain for 800 years? Arabs invaded and colonized Palestine in 633, Syria in 637, Jerusalem in 638, Egypt in 641, Persia beginning in 642. Spain was colonized in 711. Sicily in 827. Rome was conquered and sacked in 846. They only got rid of the Muslims out of Italy by calling in Viking mercenaries to wipe out the jihadists and liberate Rome. The Muslims invaded and colonized Spain for 800 years, Portugal for 600 years, Greece for 500 years, Bulgaria for 500 years, Romania for 400 years. Most people forget that a lot of Eastern Europe was actually under Arab colonial control for centuries. Much, 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 much longer than Africa was ever under European colonial control. But the Muslims didn't leave anything good behind. They didn't exactly benefit. At least the European colonials built bridges, hospitals, schools, roads, and so on. But what the Muslims do, the roads disappeared because they saw no need for roads. Who cares about wheeled transport? You just get a bunch of slaves to carry things in their heads. So even all the roads in North Africa disappeared. Disappeared. Because who needs to maintain roads? Because you got people to carry them, camels and donkeys and people, slaves can carry things. Who needs wheeled transport? And so they destroyed the entire infrastructure of North Africa, which had been so advanced, and a lot of South Eastern Europe as well. And you wonder why the people in Eastern Europe are the most hostile to Islamic immigration today. Well, they've been invaded before. Hungary was conquered for 150 years. Muslims struggled but failed to conquer Malta. They struggled and failed to conquer Austria. They had several sieges of Vienna. The Muslims struggled but failed to conquer Italy. They struggled and failed to conquer Cyprus. Muslims also struggled but failed to conquer Armenia, Poland, Georgia, Ukraine, and Russia. Bosnia, Kosovo, and Albania, which were Muslim colonies for hundreds of years, continued to be areas of intense violence and destabilization to this day. And so, 732, Battle of Poitiers in France. One wonders why so much attention has been given to the Crusades, which lasted less than 200 years, than to Islamic jihad, which has continued for 1,400 years, and in some places it's intensifying at this time. The portrayal of the Crusades as imperialistic colonial enterprises against peace-loving, tolerant Muslims who were minding their own business in the Middle East, it's imaginative fiction. While the Encyclopedia Britannica could publish many pages on the Crusades, it's silent on jihad. I mean, turn to Encyclopedia Britannica, jihad, what's that? Yet the Crusades were only a belated reaction to centuries of Islamic jihad. I might add, the Encyclopedia Britannica was specifically established to provide an anti-Christian perspective on world history. It was funded by people who hated Christianity with a goal to provide a secular, humanist, non-Christian interpretation of history. And so Encyclopedia Britannica had a thoroughly anti-Christian purpose. Seldom do historians or journalists recognize that the Crusaders were a military response of Christian Europe to 5 centuries of Islamic aggression against Christian lands. The Crusades reacted to the systematic abuse and persecution of indigenous Christian populations in these lands which the Muslims had invaded. Just take, for example, this classic picture on the left. This is of Suleiman the Magnificent's conquest of Constantinople, what today is called Istanbul, the greatest Christian city in the world at that time, the greatest church in the world at that time, the largest church. San Sophia had 12,000 people massacred in that church on that day that Constantinople fell, mostly women and children. Notice this is obviously a portrait, so they chose what's in here. A portrait takes a long time. What do they have under the horse, the hooves of this Islamic jihadist? A Christian princess dressed in white with a gold crown, blonde hair, gold crown, a obviously unarmed civilian, a woman, showing the contempt of the Muslims for Christian women. Doesn't have a soldier in armor under his hooves. I mean, it could have put anything. It's a portrait. They chose to put a blonde, long-haired, crowned Christian princess dressed in white under the hooves of his horse. This shows the mentality. And here, the crucifixion of Christian women in 1915 by the Turks in the Armenian genocide. Professor Thomas Madden, one of the 2 greatest authorities on the Crusades in the world today, has written the Crusades are quite possibly the most misunderstood event in European history. The Christians who took part in the 1999 Reconciliation Walk, you may not remember it, but I do, they traveled from Turkey to Syria, to Lebanon, to Israel to ask for forgiveness for what their ancestors had done during the Crusades some 900 years before. For sheer idiocy, this must take the cake. Had these individuals known the history, they would have realized these were previously Christian lands which the Muslims had invaded. Turkey used to be the Byzantine Empire for 1,000 years, a Christian kingdom. Muslims massacred tens of thousands of Christians in each of these places. And we're going to apologize to them for reaction to jihad? They desecrated and destroyed over 30,000 churches before the Crusades began. They demolished some of the most important churches in Christendom, such as the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. Muslims seem obsessed with the Christian Crusades, but they've forgotten their own pervasive jihad. The unintended consequence of such well-meaning but obviously misinformed Christians apologizing for the Crusades is that it encourages Muslim radicalism. It shows them that Western Christians are weak. There's nothing the Muslims respect more than strength. There's nothing they despise more than weakness. Christian apologies for the Crusades encourages the self-righteousness that's endemic in Islam. It encourages millions of Muslims in the hatred of the West in general and Christianity in particular. There is no doubt that Islamic violence against Christians has exponentially increased throughout the Middle East and worldwide since that reconciliation walk emphasis in 1999. Did the world get more peaceful? Did Muslims stop persecuting Christians? Not on your life. They've bombed over 1,000 churches in northern Nigeria alone between 2010 and 2015, with 17,000 people killed. This year, the Muslims have already killed 8,000 Christians in northern Nigeria, just this year, 2018. And we're only in the 7th month. And Christians are apologizing to Muslims for the Crusades, which ended 800 years ago. Are these people brain dead? While our brethren in Egypt are suffering vicious, violent persecution, while Christians in Egypt are being massacred and beheaded by Muslim Brotherhood, while Christians in Iraq are facing genocide. There were 1.3 million Christians in Iraq before the Americans liberated it from Saddam Hussein. Today there's not even 200,000 left. We've lost over 1 million Christians from Iraq in the last, how many years? We're talking about in less than 14 years. We're down to literally 200,000 people out of a 1.3 million community. And the answers have been there for nearly 2 millenniums. This is genocide. In fact, the number of Christians in the Muslim Middle East has decreased dramatically from 15 million Christians in the Middle East, the lowest number of Christians in any continent in the world, any section, and we're talking about the Muslim Middle East here. There were 15 million in 2010, now we have barely 2 million today. Everywhere in the world, the number of Christians has increased. Only in the Middle East has it decreased. Sorry? Less than 12 million today. That is correct. Ignorance of history makes you vulnerable to guilt manipulation and exploitation. Those who forget the lessons of history are doomed to repeat its mistakes. We must know the history of Islam to avoid the Islamization and guilt manipulation of today. So, at AD 700, you get a snapshot of the world. The Khazar Empire, which has just converted to Judaism, is right between, and what today would be considered Ukraine, between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. You can see the Magyars, they're moving towards where they're going to be the Hungarians later. The Saxons are growing, the Franks are pretty strong, the Visigoths in Spain. Islam spread massively all over the Middle East. They've taken a lot of North Africa. They're about to prepare the invasion of Spain. You can see they're starting to eat into the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire. And you can see Nubian Empire is so large it's actually absorbed Ethiopia for a short time. The Christian world, you can see there's tremendous growth of Christianity in China, but many are getting wiped out. Vast amount of Christians in the Brown area recognizes where it used to be Christian, where the Christians have gotten annihilated. They've either fled or been forcibly converted or killed. And you can see also where Christianity used to be strong, where it is now in decline. But Christianity is doing strong in Nubia and in Ethiopia. It's doing well in Central Europe and Eastern Empire, and of course in the British Isles. The main persecutors in the 7th century are Islam, overwhelmingly. The martyrs are mostly Coptic Christians and also some Greeks. Major date in the Middle Ages, AD 800. Charlemagne, or Charles the Great, is crowned Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. He was the grandson of Charles Martel the Hammer. So Charles Martel, who was basically a captain in the King's Guard, he stops the Muslim advance, and his grandson ends up being the first king of the Holy Roman Empire, AD 800, on Christmas Day. Major event. Another big event, 878, King Alfred the Great begins the conversion of the Vikings, and he lays the foundation for the common law. The Viking Age began in 793 with the attack on Lindisfarne, on the Holy Island, on the monastery there. But for a century, the Vikings have laid waste to England, but Wessex alone stands, and King Alfred the Great manages to begin not only military victory against the Vikings, but he gets them to begin the conversion to the Christian faith. He defeated them in battle. He started the English Navy, the Royal Navy, to be able to defeat the Vikings, and he is a tremendous king in so many different ways. But instead of killing his enemies, he chose to convert them. King Alfred the Great, the reformer king, we have a whole chapter on him in the manual and also in our Victorious Christians Who Changed the World, but just a few highlights. King Alfred of Wessex spent most of his life fighting against invading Danes. He's the only king in English history to be known as the Great. His reign has been recognized as one of the most important turning points in English political and ecclesiastical history. He lived through tumultuous times, and he's recognized as one of the most intelligent, devout, industrious, and effective of all medieval monarchs. Alfred was both soldier and scholar. He is a lawmaker and educator. He is an author and he is a reformer. For most of Alfred's 30 years, he was a soldier king. 30 years reign, that is. He led his people in a desperate war for survival. Alfred personally commanded in 54 pitched battles. He frequently fought against overwhelming odds. In just 5 months of 1870, he fought 9 pitched battles against the Danish Vikings. That's more than most seasoned warriors have fought in a lifetime. And he did that in just 5 months. Alfred was defeated at Reading and a few days later turned his defeat into victory at Ashdown. A tremendous time of fighting. The Battle of Ashdown, January 874, was critically important. Winston Churchill describes it: if the West Saxons had been beaten, all of England would have sunk into heathen anarchy. Since they were victorious, the hope still burned for a civilized Christian existence in this island. This was the first time the invaders had been beaten in the field. Alfred realized it was vital to create a navy to effectively defend England from the seafaring Danes. To be safe in an island, it's necessary to command the seas. You can't just wait for them to land wherever they want. In building up the English Navy from very small beginnings, Alfred has justly been called the father of the English Navy, or the Royal Navy. And so he is. Alfred also instilled a great respect for law and order in his kingdom, and it was said that a traveller might hang a valuable jewel by a bush by the roadside and nobody would dare touch it. Alfred brought scholars from Europe in order to help educate his people. He was determined to give his nation a stable system of laws based upon God's law. So he blended Mosaic law with the Sermon on the Mount and Germanic customs. So his dooms begin with the 10 Commandments. Literally, the common law of England begins with these words: I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of the house of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. You shall have no other gods before me. The whole 10 Commandments, the case laws of Moses, the golden rule of Christ, Sermon on the Mount, and a whole lot of other great biblical principles. It's thoroughly biblical and Christian. Alfred also forced King Guthrum of the Danes, at the point of the sword effectively, along with 30 of his earls, to be baptized as Christians. These were the first Viking converts to Christianity. Now, again, this is the sort of thing that needed to have been known by General MacArthur. When he had defeated Japan and the Japanese emperor came to him, I suppose I need to become a Christian. He'd need to say, yes, and let's set the baptism date for such and such. And that would have been the correct thing to do. That would have been the right thing to do for the Japanese people. It would have been good for Emperor Hirohito to open himself and his family up to the discipleship and catechism teaching of the gospel and his whole island. Now, to his credit, General MacArthur asked for 10,000 missionaries to come to Japan. He saw the place open. But being an individualistic American, he believed that we've got to do this by just persuasion only. Sadly, not even a fraction of those missionaries arrived. A few hundred, but not 10,000. They needed 10,000 missionaries to evangelize Japan. In fact, even that would have been too few. At that opportunity, imagine if Japan had been brought to Christ at key time. Not even 2% of Japan are Christians today. Not even 2%. And it could be 80 or 90%. If you get when a wave comes, you've got to surf that wave. You don't get to choose the times and the seasons. When a time comes, you've got to take that time. Praise God that King Alfred saw the time. And my ancestors were amongst those Viking invaders. So the original Hammonds were battle axe wielding Viking invaders drinking blood out of their enemies' skulls. And so a good thing they got converted by their enemies, because, we've stopped chopping people up with axes. Through virtue and valor, through tactics and tenacity, Alfred fought the Viking invaders to a standstill, and he turned them back out of his country, and he succeeded in uniting the fragmented dominions of England against a common foe. He's the first true king of England, because up till then there was a king of Wessex and a king of Mercia, but a king of Northumbria. There wasn't a king of England. His Christian courage was an inspiration to all. Now, having rescued his country from invasion, he set to work reforming the laws, the customs, and the culture of his people. He personally translated many Latin works into Anglo-Saxon, so that the English people could read them. And amongst his many translation projects was Bede's Ecclesiastical History from Latin into Saxon, Orosius's Universal History, and Gregory's Pastoral Theology, and Aesop's Fables, and Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy, and the Psalms of David. Alfred was also the author of many original titles, including a book against unjust judges. England desired every Englishman to learn to read, and so he devised a plan for the general education of the people. He donated half of his personal income to church schools. Alfred taught that for a kingdom to be effective, there needed to be men of prayer, men of war, and men of work. These are the three estates: men of prayer, men of war, men of work. Alfred insisted all his nobles must learn to read, and they must learn the great history and heritage of Christendom. And he wrote local government ought to be synonymous with local Christian virtue, otherwise it becomes local tyranny, local corruption, and local iniquity. He founded 2 monasteries and numerous schools, and his charities were numerous. He received and cared for foreigners and strangers in his court, and he allocated 1/8 of his revenue to care for the poor and needy. He also instituted a system of fortified posts or burgs. You just think of anything that ends with a burg, that's a fort. He established a national militia, the Fyrd, and he ensured that the common people were armed, trained, and organized for local defense. Every man must be armed. That's written in the Dooms of King Alfred. He enlarged and improved the English fleet. In fact, there wasn't an English fleet before him at all. And he entrenched and enforced the law of God as the common law of England. So that today, when they speak about the common law in England, why does it mean common law? It's common to all. High and low, nobles, government, everyone. The same law applies to all, which is a biblical principle. Numbers 15:15. Historians have noted that while the world has had other examples of kings who've been great generals or great magistrates, no other sovereign did more in battle, in rulemaking, in forming and developing the literature and education of the people, as well as working for the spiritual benefit of both subjects and enemies. Winston Churchill marveled that Alfred should have wished to convert these savage foes. This sublime power to rise above the whole force of circumstances, to remain unbiased by the extremes of victory or defeat, to persevere in the teeth of disaster, to greet returning fortune with a cool eye, to have faith in men after repeated betrayals, raises Alfred far above the tumult of barbaric wars to his pinnacle of deathless victory. And here at Wantage, I took these pictures of Alfred with his Dane axe, that massive battle axe, and the scroll in his hand, showing battle, warrior, and scholar and lawmaker, educator. Edmund Burke wrote of Alfred, "One cannot help being amazed that a prince who lived in such turbulent times, who commanded personally in 54 pitched battles, who had so disordered a province to regulate, who was not only a legislator, but a judge, and who was continually superintending his armies, his navies, the traffic of his kingdom, his revenues, and the conduct of all his officers, could have bestowed so much of his time on religious exercise and speculative knowledge, but the exertion of all his faculties and virtues seemed to have given mutual strength to all of them." And so, what a great leader. And that's why he's called Alfred the Great. King Alfred stands out as the model king, the perfect knight, a dedicated Christian, a Protestant before Protestantism, a soldier and scholar, a rulemaker and educator, author and reformer. He successfully fought against spiritual decay within the English church, as well as against the Viking invaders, and he created the first English navy. He authored English literature. He ensured the survival of Christianity in England. he began the great process of converting the bloodthirsty Viking invaders to Christianity. And here's his monument in Wantage, his birthplace in England. Alfred found learning dead, and he restored it. Education neglected, and he revived it. The laws powerless, and he gave them force. The church debased, and he raised it. The land ravaged by a fearful enemy, from which he delivered it. Alfred's name will live as long as mankind shall respect the past. That's on the base of this monument. So, the year 800, here's the picture, the Scandinavians. Interesting how Scandinavia looks like a lion leaping down, which it really was. You can see the Franks have expanded dramatically. They even control a lot of Italy now and what today is Austria. You can see how the Muslims have moved in to take most of Spain, and they even moved partly into France. They've taken over the whole of North Africa and the Middle East, and they're moving into Asia. You can see how the Ethiopian and Nubian empires are quite solidly strong there. The Tang Empire in China, and the Mayans still ripping beating hearts out of living people in what today is Central America. The church in the 9th century, mostly under persecution, vicious persecution. Churches being annihilated in the 9th century in China after centuries of Christian witness in China. You can see throughout the North African and Muslim world, Christianity is being severely persecuted. The green line represents the extent, the limit of Islamic conquests. Of course, there's and raids, but then there's a bit of retreat as well. Who the persecutors in the 9th century? Mostly the Muslims, but also the Chinese and the Vikings. The empires at the end of the 9th century, you can see there's the Viking kingdoms have spread, taken over the whole of eastern seaboard of Britain, Northumbria and so on, established York. Dublin is established in Ireland by the Vikings. By the way, they say all the red hair in the world, which is only about less than 0.8%, so it's less than 1%, the world's population red hair. All the red hair in the world, they say, comes from the Vikings. And that's how it came to Ireland too. So here you can see the empires of the world. The Khazars still quite strong there. The Bulgarian empire is growing up. The Magyars have taken over a huge section, what today is Hungary. 966, the Polish people convert to Christianity. Again, the kings converted and the people convert. 988, the Russians convert to Christianity. Interesting, in my lifetime, the Russians celebrate their millennium of Christianity. And of course, they were under the Soviets then. Just a year before the Berlin Wall came down, just 3 years before the Soviet Union collapsed, the Russians celebrate their millennium of Christianity. And there's no doubt that helped revive this historical milestone, revived Christianity in Russia, so they kicked out the communists, rebuilt the magnificent Christ the Savior Cathedral in Moscow, and many other good things. Also, AD 995, Norway converts to Christianity. The Vikings converted, and that's quite a story that needs a fair bit of focus as well.